The month of August is filled with warm nights and unpredictable thunderstorms where I live, which inspired this topic. Rainstorms have always stirred a mix of emotions for me, as I've enjoyed sitting by the window watching them. When I was 14, the thrill of being left home alone was something I relished. My parents had recently begun letting me stay by myself overnight. Their only rules were simple: no leaving the house and no visitors. I was perfectly fine with that. There was something liberating about cranking up my music or playing games without my dad telling me to lower the volume. That evening it was raining, a light drizzle that soon turned into a full-blown storm. I stood on the porch for a while, watching the flashes of lightning. I've always felt storms make staying in cozier. After a while, I decided to move my gaming setup to the family room downstairs, where my dad's massive flat-screen TV and sound system resided. Playing on that screen was a privilege reserved for nights like this. The family room was located half a flight of stairs down from the main living area and had a sliding door that opened into the backyard. As I settled in, I fired up Halo on the console and joined an online match with my friend Ryan. My headset wasn't great. It only picked up the voices of other players in the game, but for a 14-year-old it was all I needed. Everything was perfect until the peace was interrupted by the doorbell. It was a little after 9 p.m. and the house was quiet except for the hum of my console and the faint chatter of my online match. I had just paused my game to grab a drink when the doorbell rang, echoing sharply through the stillness. I told Ryan, my gaming buddy, about it, half expecting him to laugh it off. And he did. "Probably some random neighbor," he joked. "Go check it out. Maybe it's a pizza delivery." But something didn't sit right with me. My parents never rang the doorbell. They had keys. The thought unsettled me, a tiny prick of dread beginning to form at the back of my mind. For a moment I lingered, torn between curiosity and caution. Eventually I decided to head upstairs and take a look, the game forgotten behind me. My heart thudded in my chest as I climbed the steps, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. At the top I moved toward the front door, my bare feet padding softly against the floor. I hesitated as I reached the peephole, the small glass circle suddenly feeling like a fragile barrier between me and whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was a pause, a long, unnerving silence that stretched on just long enough to make me regret speaking. Then a deep, gravelly male voice responded, "I need to use a phone." The words were clipped, the tone heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Alarm bells went off in my head and I froze, unsure how to respond. My fingers hovered over the lock, but instinct kicked in, and I retreated slowly, step by careful step, until I was back at the staircase. I hurried downstairs, trying to shake the growing unease, and told Ryan what had just happened. His reaction was immediate and sharp, cutting through my rising anxiety like a knife. "That's creepy as hell. Whatever you do, don't open the door." The doorbell rang again, this time more insistent, as if whoever was out there knew I was hesitating. The sound reverberated through the house, and I clenched my fist to stop them from trembling. My breathing grew shallow, but I forced myself to stay still, ignoring the ringing and hoping, praying that they'd leave. Minutes passed, each one dragging on longer than the last, until finally the sound stopped. The oppressive silence that followed felt almost worse. My body was tense, every nerve on edge, straining to detect even the faintest sound. And yet, nothing came. Slowly, I convinced myself the stranger was gone, that I had overreacted. Maybe it had just been a confused passerby. I let out a shaky breath, settling back into my chair. The familiar glow of the game screen filled the room, and I eased into the rhythm of the match, the tension slowly draining from my shoulders. But as I played, a strange feeling began to creep in, like being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I resisted the urge to glance toward the darkened windows. Then I heard it, the faintest tap, tap, tap against the glass behind me. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around, expecting to see nothing but the distorted reflection of the room in the window. Instead, a pale, sallow face was pressed against the glass, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. Its eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking, filled with something unholy. I screamed, the sound erupting from me involuntarily, and the figure's hand raised, slowly, deliberately, to tap once more on the window pane, the rhythm mocking my rising terror. Just as I was beginning to feel a fragile sense of ease again, the comforting silence of the night was broken. A faint noise, a shuffling, deliberate yet unnerving, caught my attention to my right. My breath hitched as I turned my head toward the sound. The sliding backyard door, which had been closed only moments ago, was gliding shut again. And then, stepping into the dim light of the room, I saw him. A tall, imposing figure whose presence immediately turned my veins to ice. It wasn't my dad. It was a stranger. For a split second I froze, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and terror. Panic hit me like a crashing wave, primal and overwhelming. My fingers, once gripping the game controller, let go reflexively as I scrambled to my feet, stumbling slightly in my haste. Without a second thought, I bolted down the hall to the office, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor, and threw the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled frantically with the lock, and as it clicked into place, the doorknob rattled violently. The man was already there. He was fast. Too fast. His presence on the other side of the door felt suffocating, a looming shadow pressing down on my resolve. My heart pounded erratically, the sound almost drowning out the relentless rattling of the knob. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the dim office, desperate for a plan. I knew the room had two exits. One led to the family room, now connected to where the stranger was, the other to the garage. My mind raced to map out my escape, but time was slipping through my fingers. The rattling intensified, and then came his voice, deep, grating, and laced with menace. "Kid, open the door!" he demanded, his tone growing sharper with each word. My stomach churned. The voice seemed wrong, inhuman, almost guttural, as if something monstrous lurked behind his forced calm. When his shouting turned into enraged, guttural screams, and the pounding on the door began in earnest, I felt a primal fear, unlike anything I'd known before. The door quivered under the force of his blows, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I moved toward the garage exit, my hands trembling as I reached for the button to open the motorized door. The whirring of the motor sounded impossibly loud, the mechanical noise reverberating in the suffocating silence. I froze for a moment, straining to hear whether the man had noticed. He had. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers crawling down my spine. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, the words stretching unnaturally, as if they came from a mouth no longer human. The garage door creaked open agonizingly slowly, revealing the night beyond. A storm had swept in, and sheets of rain fell relentlessly. Without waiting another second, I dropped to my knees and crawled under the half-open door, feeling the wet pavement scrape against my skin. Lightning flashed, illuminating the driveway in stark, unnatural brightness. As I ran barefoot through the downpour, I glanced back. A pale, cadaverous face peered out from the darkness, its sunken eyes glowing faintly, lips curling into a malevolent grin. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the thunder overhead, and sprinted toward Mr. Grayson's house, not daring to look back again. I rang their doorbell with shaking hands, the cold rain soaking me to the bone and blurring my vision. The storm howled behind me, an ominous backdrop to my desperate plea for safety. When Mr. Grayson opened the door, I could barely speak, collapsing into his arms as the words tumbled out. "Please, you have to help me." His warm, steady hands held me upright as his eyes filled with concern. Moments later, his wife appeared, her face pale as she took in my drenched and trembling form. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Through chattering teeth and ragged breaths, I managed to explain what had just happened. A stranger forcing his way into my home, claiming it as his own. The Graysons exchanged a glance, their expressions darkening as the gravity of my words sank in. Mr. Grayson, calm but urgent, guided me inside while his wife fetched a towel and a blanket. "Stay here," he said firmly. "We'll handle this." Yet the way his voice faltered at the end betrayed his unease. He picked up the phone to call the police, his voice low but deliberate as he described the situation. "Please hurry," I heard him say, his usually steady tone tinged with an edge of fear. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as we waited. Every creak of the house made my heart race, and the rain pounding against the windows only amplified the tension. The minutes felt like hours, the silence between us broken only by the occasional reassurances from Mrs. Grayson. Still, I could tell they were as unsettled as I was. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights cut through the storm outside, and a knock on the door signaled the arrival of the police. Mr. Grayson stepped out to speak with the officers, pointing them toward my house. I stayed frozen on their couch, wrapped tightly in the blanket Mrs. Grayson had given me. The faint murmur of their conversation outside was drowned out by the thunder, and I could only sit there, helpless and terrified, imagining what might be happening at my home. It wasn't long before I saw the silhouette of a man being led out of my house in handcuffs. His face was obscured by the rain, but even from a distance I could hear his muffled protests. "This is my house! That's my son!" he yelled, his words slurred and frantic. My stomach churned as I realized he truly believed what he was saying. His wild eyes and unsteady gait hinted at intoxication, but there was something darker, more unsettling about his demeanor. The officers returned to assure me he was in custody. They explained his behavior, likely a combination of drugs and delusions, and promised he wouldn't be released anytime soon. My parents, having been notified, decided to press charges for breaking and entering. I thought the nightmare was over, but when they mentioned his name, Henry Black, a chill ran down my spine. Something about it felt wrong, familiar even, though I couldn't place why. Henry was convicted of trespassing, and for years I tried to convince myself it was just a random act. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he had known more than he let on. Sometimes late at night, I would wake to the sound of the rain and imagine him out there, watching, waiting. Though he never returned after his release, his shadow lingered in my mind, a quiet reminder that safety is never guaranteed. I never imagined, not in my wildest dreams or darkest nightmares, that anything truly terrifying could ever happen to me. My life has always been so predictable, almost painfully ordinary, to the point where any deviation from the norm felt like a rare occurrence worthy of note. I'm the kind of person who thrives on routine, someone who rarely experiences surprises, let alone anything sinister or shocking. That's why I've always felt a strange comfort in immersing myself in creepy YouTube videos. Whether it's urban legends spun into spine-tingling tales or the recounting of supposedly true horror stories, these things always seemed like a distant reality, entertaining but unreal. Even now, after everything, I still watch them, though with a newfound sense of unease. You see, since my own horrifying encounter, these stories no longer feel like harmless fiction. They carry an unsettling weight, as if reminding me that horror doesn't just live in stories. It can happen to anyone, even me. It all started in the dead of night, when the world was at its quietest, and the shadows felt heavier. I'm not entirely sure of the exact time, but I'd guess it was around 3:30 a.m. The kind of hour when everyone else in the house was fast asleep, wrapped in the comfort of dreams. My dad, my sister, and my uncle were all tucked away in their rooms, oblivious to the storm raging outside. For weeks now, thunderstorms had been a near-daily occurrence, rolling in like clockwork and battering the neighborhood with their fury. That night was no exception. I've always been fascinated by storms, the flash of lightning illuminating the sky, the low rumble of thunder that seems to shake the earth. There's something oddly mesmerizing about watching nature unleash its power from the safety of my bedroom window. But there's one thing I've never liked: the wind. It has this unpredictable nature, one moment soft and whispering, the next howling and ferocious. That night the wind seemed alive, almost as if it had a personality of its own. The storm, as it turned out, was one of the worst I'd witnessed in years. The wind hurled what felt like tiny rocks against my window, creating a relentless tapping sound that added to the chaos. But for some reason, I found the cacophony oddly soothing. It was like a soundtrack to my late-night browsing session as I scrolled through forums, losing myself in random posts. Then, without warning, everything changed. The house was plunged into darkness as the power cut out in an instant. For a brief moment, my heart raced, startled by the sudden silence from my fan and the abrupt loss of light. Still, I wasn't overly concerned. My phone had a decent charge, and I could rely on mobile data to continue scrolling. I tried to focus on my screen, but a creeping drowsiness began to pull at me. Reluctantly, I set my phone aside, deciding it was time to call it a night. As I placed my phone on the nightstand and rolled over, I felt sleep claim me almost instantly. The next thing I remember was waking up to a peculiar stillness. The storm had subsided, leaving behind only the faintest whispers of wind. At first, I thought the silence was a welcome change, but something about it felt unnerving, almost unnatural. I shifted in bed, trying to find a more comfortable position, only to realize my throat was unbearably dry. I swallowed a few times, hoping the discomfort would pass, but it didn't. After a while, I gave up on trying to fall back asleep and decided to get a drink of water instead. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The moment I opened my bedroom door, an icy gust of air greeted me, making me shiver. The temperature in the living room felt like it had plummeted dramatically since I last checked. I grabbed the nearest sweatshirt and pulled it on, hoping it would help ward off the chill as I made my way to the kitchen. Each step seemed to amplify the sound of the wind, which had picked up again, its eerie whistle echoing through the darkened house. When I finally reached the kitchen, I grabbed a glass from the cupboard and started filling it with water. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The back door was wide open. The sight of the open door sent a wave of fear coursing through me. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the dark void beyond the threshold. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone broken in? Was there a stranger lurking just outside? I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that my uncle might have forgotten to close it earlier. Still, the unease lingered. Forcing myself to move, I walked over to the door, stealing a glance over my shoulder as paranoia crept in. I slid the door shut with trembling hands, locked it securely, and hastily made my way back to my room, every instinct screaming at me to get away from the darkness behind the glass. I set my phone on my nightstand, rolled over. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up to an eerie stillness. The rain had stopped, and only a faint wind remained. I shifted to get more comfortable, but realized my throat was parched. After a few failed attempts to fall back asleep, I gave in. I grabbed my phone, turned on its flashlight, and decided to head to the kitchen for a glass of water. The moment I opened my bedroom door, a blast of cold air hit me. The living room was freezing. Grabbing a sweatshirt, I made my way to the kitchen, noticing how the wind seemed louder with every step. When I got there, I grabbed a glass and started filling it at the sink. That's when I noticed something odd. The back door was wide open. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the open door. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself that my uncle must have left it ajar earlier and forgotten about it. I closed and locked it, stealing a glance over my shoulder before quickly heading back to my room. Once inside, I shut the door behind me, placed the water on my nightstand, and sat on the bed. Despite my efforts to calm down, the thought that someone might have been inside the house wouldn't leave my mind. I got up, pushed my desk chair against the door, and even checked my closet just to be sure. Finally, I lay back down, keeping my phone's flashlight on as a makeshift nightlight. Just as I started to relax, I heard a faint noise, a creak from under the bed. My heart stopped. How could I have forgotten to check there? Summoning every ounce of courage, I leaned over and shone the light under the bed. That's when I saw her. A gaunt, skeletal woman with bloodshot eyes and jagged yellow teeth was staring back at me. Her twisted grin was something out of a nightmare. For a moment, we locked eyes before she let out a horrifying, witch-like cackle. Panic surged through me, erasing all logic and leaving only pure instinct. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I launched myself off the bed, nearly tripping as I shoved the chair blocking the door out of the way. The screech of wood against the floor sounded deafening in the otherwise silent room. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every other noise. I bolted down the hallway, adrenaline propelling me forward, my breaths sharp and ragged. When I reached my dad's door, I didn't hesitate, hammering on it with both fists and shouting his name as loudly as I could. The house was alive now, my sister's voice groggy and confused, calling out from her room. The door swung open almost immediately, and there he stood, my dad, disheveled but alert, gripping something in his hand. I froze when I saw it. A gun. I had no idea he even owned one, and the sight of it in his grasp made the situation feel 10 times more real. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice low but urgent. "There's someone in the house," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Without hesitation, he stepped into the hallway, motioning for me to stay behind him. We moved cautiously down the hall, the air thick with tension. My sister had joined us now, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes wide with fear. I could hear the faint creak of floorboards beneath our feet, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. The flashlight on my phone cast long, eerie shadows against the walls as I followed closely behind my dad. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest, and every step toward my room sent shivers down my spine. As we approached the door, my dad raised a hand signaling us to stop. He pressed himself against the wall, his breathing steady despite the palpable tension. Then, in one swift motion, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, the gun raised. For a split second, everything was still. Then we saw it. A fleeting glimpse of something pale and otherworldly darting toward the open window. My dad didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot, the deafening crack of the gun shattering the silence. The figure moved so quickly it was almost a blur, disappearing into the night before we could get a clear look. My dad rushed to the window, leaning out to scan the yard below, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. It was as if the night itself had swallowed whoever or whatever it was. He lowered the gun, his shoulders tense. "She's gone," he muttered, though the certainty in his voice was forced. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. My sister clung to me, her hands ice cold. "Should we call the police?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. My dad shook his head. "We have no proof," he said grimly. "No cameras, no evidence. They'd just think we imagined it." His words felt like a punch to the gut. We were left with nothing but questions. Who was she? Why had she come? And perhaps most unsettling, how long had she been there before I woke up? The days following that night were a blur of paranoia and unease. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. My dad wasted no time reinforcing the house. New locks, motion sensors, floodlights that would make the yard as bright as day if triggered. The back door that had been left open was replaced entirely, the flimsy old one swapped for something heavier and far more secure. But no amount of preparation could erase the memory of that gaunt, skeletal figure with bloodshot eyes. I no longer felt safe, not even in my own bed. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Every rustle of wind outside my window made my heart race. The thought that she might return, that she might have been more than just a disturbed intruder, lingered in the back of my mind. My once comfortable routine was shattered, replaced by an awareness that nothing, no matter how ordinary it seemed, was ever truly safe. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: never take security for granted. Lock your doors, set your alarms, and stay vigilant. Because no matter how peaceful your life may seem, you never know what might be watching or waiting just outside. It was a sweltering August afternoon when my friend Mia and I packed up the car and set out for a weekend escape at my uncle's secluded lake cabin. Nestled deep in the woods and perched near the edge of a calm, glistening lake, the cabin wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had the essentials: electricity, running water, and a shower that sometimes sputtered but worked well enough. We jokingly called it glamping, though its rustic charm was far closer to camping than luxury. The cabin itself was modest, barely 500 square feet, with one tiny bedroom crammed into a corner, a pull-out sofa in the open living area, and a compact, slightly outdated kitchen. Still, it was cozy and had everything we needed for a short retreat. The area was wonderfully remote. No noisy neighbors, no buzzing traffic, just the hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Despite being so far removed from civilization, there was plenty to keep us entertained. The lake was perfect for kayaking, while nearby trails offered endless opportunities for hiking and mountain biking. We had our itinerary meticulously planned, every detail accounted for, or so we thought. We arrived late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the treetops, casting long, ominous shadows across the cabin's weathered wood exterior. Unpacking was quick, and we treated ourselves to a hearty dinner at a small diner in the closest town, still a good 40-minute drive away. On our way back, we stopped to pick up supplies, filling the car with snacks, bottled water, and enough provisions to last the weekend. By the time we returned to the cabin, the stars were out, twinkling against a moonless sky. Yet something about the stillness of the forest felt heavier than usual, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Saturday started beautifully. The morning was crisp and bright, the lake glittering in the early sunlight as we paddled across its smooth surface. We spent the first half of the day exploring winding trails and snapping pictures of the dense, almost magical woods. But by mid-afternoon, the atmosphere shifted. The sky, once a vibrant blue, turned a muted grey, and the air seemed to grow thicker, charged with an uneasy energy. By the time we made it back to the cabin, towering storm clouds loomed overhead, their dark masses swirling with ominous intent. The first rumble of thunder echoed faintly in the distance, like the growl of a waking beast. We hurried to bring our gear inside, stowing everything securely in the shed just as the first fat drops of rain splattered against the porch. As evening settled in, the storm arrived in full force. The rain lashed against the cabin's windows with relentless fury, and thunder boomed so loudly it felt as if the ground itself trembled in response. Lightning streaked across the sky with such intensity and frequency, it was almost blinding, illuminating the dense forest in short, electric bursts. We decided to take our dinner out to the covered porch, eager to witness nature's raw power up close. At first, it was mesmerizing. Long, jagged bolts of lightning split the darkened sky, followed almost immediately by deafening cracks of thunder that reverberated through the woods. Yet as we sat there in awe, a strange feeling crept over me, an unsettling sense that we weren't entirely alone. The storm was fierce, almost alive in its ferocity, but there was something else, something quieter and far more unnerving, hidden in the shadows just beyond the tree line. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the intensity of the storm playing tricks on my mind. But when Mia glanced at me and whispered, "Do you feel that?" I realized I wasn't imagining it. We were right in the heart of the storm, and maybe, just maybe, not alone in it. Then came a sound that made both of us freeze. A voice. It was faint, almost swallowed by the storm, but unmistakably human. The sound drifted in from the woods, carried on the gusting wind. At first it was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was insistent, almost deliberate. Someone was out there. In a place as isolated as this, any voice would have been cause for concern. But to hear one during a storm so violent, when even the animals had fallen silent, sent a chill through me. Mia immediately suggested it could be a lost camper, but the thought didn't comfort me. Something about it felt wrong. Compelled by a mix of dread and curiosity, I edged closer to the railing of the porch. Rain sprayed against my face as I leaned out, trying to see through the torrent. Suddenly a jagged flash of lightning illuminated the woods, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line. They were motionless, their silhouette eerily calm against the chaos of the storm. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to Mia to tell her. She brushed it off with a nervous laugh, accusing me of trying to scare her. "Very funny," she said, though her voice betrayed unease. But I wasn't joking. Against my better judgment, I cupped my hands and shouted into the storm, asking if they needed help. The wind snatched my words away, scattering them into the night. The figure remained still, an unyielding presence in the shadows. It didn't approach, didn't wave, didn't react in any way. It just stood there, staring. Uneasy, I retreated into the cabin, feigning calm for Mia's sake. She asked again if we should do something, and I shook my head, forcing a weak smile. "Not unless they come knocking," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. But deep down, unease churned in my gut. I glanced back outside, unable to stop myself. Another flash of lightning lit up the scene, and my stomach turned. The figure was closer now, much closer. What had been a safe distance of several yards was now a mere 20 feet. They were near the edge of the porch, standing just beyond the pool of light cast by the cabin's front window. My heart hammered as I quickly locked the door, my fingers fumbling with the latch. Mia could see the fear in my eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I tried to reassure her, but I couldn't shake the dread gnawing at me. The storm's relentless roar suddenly seemed secondary to the faint creaking of footsteps on the porch. I strained to listen, and then it came, the unmistakable sound of shuffling, almost like fingers brushing against the door. It wasn't a knock. It was something else, deliberate and unnatural, like someone testing the barrier between us. Mia retreated to the bedroom, her fear palpable. I stayed in the main room, every nerve on edge. I killed the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing intermittently, each burst offering fleeting glimpses of the drenched porch. I moved cautiously to the window, pressing myself against the wall, and pulled back the curtain just enough to see. There it was again. The figure stood mere feet from the window, close enough for me to see the details of its clothing. Light-colored and sodden from the storm, My breath quickened as I realized they were looking straight at the window. I couldn't make out their face through the rain-streaked glass, but their stillness was unnerving, their presence unnatural. Desperation took over, and I shouted as loudly as I could, "Get out of here!" My voice cracked, but I tried to sound commanding, menacing even. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move. It was as if they were waiting for something only they knew. Panic coursed through me. My phone was useless. Storms like this always wiped out the already weak signal in the area. I realized then how utterly cut off we were. The storm was a prison, trapping us with whatever or whoever was out there. My hands shook as I reached for the old shotgun my uncle kept tucked away in the bedroom closet, its wooden stock smooth from years of use but sturdy enough to feel reassuring. I fumbled with the shells, loading them one by one, each click of the mechanism a grim reminder of the seriousness of the situation. The storm raged on, and for a brief moment the roar of the wind and the pounding rain masked everything else. Then, a sharp, deafening bang shattered the fragile silence, a sudden strike against the window behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, and almost immediately came another bang, this time from the kitchen. The realization struck me like ice water. This wasn't just one person. There had to be more. At least two, maybe more. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. What did they want? Were they trying to scare us? Or worse? Determined not to let fear paralyze me, I made my way to the front door, moving as quietly as possible. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the sound almost as loud as the storm outside. As I gripped the shotgun tightly, I unlocked the door, the faint click feeling deafening in the charged air. I flung it open in one swift motion, stepping out onto the porch, prepared to confront whatever or whoever was out there. But the porch was empty. The rain came down in heavy sheets, and the storm's fury distorted every shadow, every movement at the edge of my vision. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the base of the steps, just beyond the reach of the porch light. They didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, their face obscured by the rain and the shadows. A surge of adrenaline took over. I raised the shotgun, pointed it toward the sky, and fired a warning shot. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the storm, momentarily drowning out the thunder. The figure bolted, their movements frantic as they disappeared into the woods. Over the sound of the storm, I caught the unmistakable noise of shouting. Two voices, distinct but muffled, carried on the wind as they faded deeper into the forest. For a long moment I stood there, the shotgun still raised, my breath coming in short gasps. The rain soaked through my clothes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. Every instinct told me to retreat, to lock the door, and to wait out the night. But even as I stepped back inside and secured the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the storm itself wasn't enough to keep them at bay. The rest of the night was a tense blur. Mia and I didn't sleep. We barely spoke. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the window set my nerves on edge. I kept the shotgun within reach, my eyes darting to the windows at every flash of lightning, half expecting to see those figures again, standing just outside. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving the world eerily still. The cabin bore no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or damaged doors. It was as if the events of the night had been some fevered nightmare conjured by the storm. But the unease lingered, a heavy presence that neither of us could shake. We packed quickly, avoiding the forested trails and sticking to the main road. The drive back felt surreal, the safety of civilization both comforting and fragile. I've returned to the cabin a few times since, always with family, never alone. And every time, I find myself scanning the tree line, waiting for another glimpse of those silent figures who turned one stormy night into something I'll never forget. Have you ever experienced something similar or had an unexplainable, chilling encounter? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales.